$41,000 a year. That was the salary. Not the before picture, not the sad part of the story that gets fixed later. That was the number the entire thing was built on, start to finish. And 11 years in, it had turned into something that made people who earned 3 times as much go quiet when they found out. This is how a small salary beats a big one. Slowly. I want to start by defending the number because your instinct is all ready to apologize for it. 41,000. Say it out loud and something in you flinches. It's not a poverty number and it's not a comfortable number. It's the number that sits in the exact place where nobody respects it. Too much to be a tragedy, too little to be a win. The number you'd round up if a stranger asked, not because you're a liar, but because 41 has a smallness to it that you feel in your chest before you've even finished saying it. And here's the thing nobody tells you about that number. It is not the problem. It was never the problem. The problem is what a bigger number would have let you get away with, and what this one didn't. Let me tell you about a Thursday. Late, a little after 9 at night, the kind of hour where the day is technically over but you haven't agreed to let it end yet. You're standing in a kitchen that isn't really yours, in an apartment that isn't really yours either, because you rent, because $41,000 a year does not buy a kitchen you own, and you're holding a paycheck stub, a real one, paper, because the place you worked still printed them, and you're not looking at the big number on it, the salary, you're looking at the small number underneath, the part that was left after everything else took its cut. And you did a thing that night that you would end up doing, quietly, for 11 years. You took a piece of that small leftover number and you moved it somewhere it couldn't follow you back. $300. That's what it was. That first Thursday, $300 out of a paycheck that couldn't really spare it, moved into an account you promised yourself you would not look at, would not touch, would not treat as real. And then you put the stub in a drawer and you went to bed and nothing happened. Nothing happened for a very long time. That's the part of the story the montage refuses to show you, and it's the only part that actually matters. Now, I need to tell you about Marcus, because you don't understand your own number until you've stood next to his. Marcus worked where you worked. Same warehouse, same concrete floor, same forklifts, same fluorescent lights that hummed a note you could hear in your teeth by the end of a shift. But Marcus was good, genuinely good, faster than you, sharper than you, the guy the managers actually noticed. And within about 2 years, Marcus had done the thing you're supposed to do. He climbed. He got the better title, the better shift, and then he left for a company across town that paid him nearly double. Marcus made money you couldn't imagine making. And I want you to hold on to that because everything I'm about to tell you only lands if you believe me that Marcus won. On paper, for years, Marcus was winning and you were not. Here's what Marcus bought with winning. He bought a car that announced itself before he got out of it. He bought an apartment with a view he was never home early enough to look at. He bought the good version of everything, the version with the logo, because when you go from your number to his number, the first thing that happens is your definition of normal moves up to meet the money. Not on purpose. You don't decide to inflate. It just happens, quietly, the way warm air fills a room. Marcus didn't feel rich. That's the part that would have surprised you if you'd asked him. Marcus felt exactly as stretched as you did because Marcus had built a life that cost almost precisely what Marcus made. He'd out-earned you by double, and he'd outspent you by double, and the gap between the two, the only gap that has ever mattered, was the same size for both of you. Except yours had $300 in it every month and his had nothing. That's the whole secret, and I just told it to you. And you're going to underreact to it, because it's too simple to feel true. The wealth was never in the salary, the wealth was in the gap. And the cruel joke of a big paycheck is that it doesn't widen the gap. It gives you permission to close it. Let me sit in that because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. When you make $41,000, you cannot lie to yourself about margin. There isn't any. Every dollar is accounted for by Wednesday. So the 300 you moved, you had to actually feel. You felt it in the coffee you made at home. You felt it in the car you kept driving long after it stopped being something you'd choose to be seen in. You felt it in the vacations that were actually just a few days off spent in your own apartment. The small salary forced you to build a life that was smaller than your income, and it forced you to feel every inch of the distance. And that distance, that felt deliberate, slightly uncomfortable distance, was the entire engine. Marcus never built the engine because Marcus never had to feel anything. When you make a lot, the margin hides. You can save nothing and still have money left at the end of the month, so you never develop the muscle because the muscle only grows against resistance, and a big paycheck removes the resistance. Marcus had every advantage except the one that mattered. He was never forced to become the kind of person who could hold on to money because he never once ran out of it fast enough to notice it leaving. So, the box. There's a box I need to tell you about because it's how I keep time in this story. When you moved into that first apartment, the not really yours one, your things came in a handful of boxes, and most of them you unpacked and broke down and forgot. But one of them you kept, a plain cardboard box, taped along the bottom seam with too much tape because you didn't trust it. And in that box went the things that didn't have a place yet: the papers, the stub eventually, and the ones that came after it. And when you moved the next time, a year and a half later, to another apartment that also wasn't yours, you didn't unpack that box either. You just carried it, retaped the seam because the first tape had gone brittle, and carried it. That box moved with you 6 times over 11 years. Same box. And every time you picked it up, it felt exactly the same weight because paper doesn't weigh anything. And that was the joke of it. The thing you'd think about standing in yet another empty room with the box in your arms. It felt like nothing. It felt like you were carrying nothing. 11 years of the small leftover number moved every month into the account you didn't look at, and it weighed nothing, and it looked like nothing. And if you'd told anyone what was slowly happening inside it, they would have looked at your car and your apartment and your $41,000 and quietly decided you were confused about your own life. Because here's what it costs: the small salary road, and I'm not going to pretend it's free. It costs you being understood. For 11 years, nobody knew. Nobody could know, because the whole mechanism only works if you don't spend it, and not spending is invisible. You cannot see a saved dollar. You can see a spent one on someone's wrist, in their driveway, on their feet. But the saved dollar looks like exactly nothing, looks like a person who couldn't afford the thing. And so, for over a decade, the world's honest read on you was, he's the one who never quite made it. And you had to be okay with that read. You had to let people be a little sorry for you. You had to watch Marcus and the 10 Marcuses after him pass you on the outside doing 80, and you had to keep doing the boring thing at the boring speed in the boring car with the box in the closet that weighed nothing. I won't tell you that part didn't sting. It stung on specific nameable days. It stung at a wedding once, where the seating told a story about who'd done well and who hadn't, and you knew which table you were at. It stung when a younger cousin, genuinely kind, offered to cover you for something, the way you cover someone you've decided is behind. You let them. What were you going to say? That the account you weren't looking at had quietly grown teeth? You didn't even fully believe it yourself, so you said thank you, and you felt the specific heat of being helped, and you drove home in the car that told everyone exactly what they already thought. There was a manager once at the warehouse, a decent guy, who pulled you aside near the end of a shift with the kind of gentleness people use when they've decided something sad about you. He told you he'd noticed you'd been there a long time. He said it like it was a thing to be sorry about. He wanted to help. He knew a guy at another company could put in a word, get you a real bump, get you moving, because a man your age shouldn't still be making what you were making. And he meant every bit of it kindly, which is what made it land the way it did. You thanked him. You said you'd think about it. And you drove home thinking about the account you weren't looking at, which even then, even years before the end, was already worth more than the raise he was offering to help you chase. And you understood in that car that you were going to spend your whole life being gently pitied by people you were quietly outpacing, and that there would never be a way to explain it, and that even if there were, explaining it would break it. The pity was the price of the privacy, and the privacy was the price of the whole thing. That's the toll. It's not money. The math was always going to work. Compounding isn't a belief, it's just patience with a total at the end. The toll is years of being the person others quietly rank below themselves, and knowing you can't correct the record because the only proof is a number you refuse to spend, which means the only proof is invisible, which means there is no proof, which means you carry it alone. The box in the closet was the only witness, and the box couldn't talk and weighed nothing. And I have to be honest about the middle, because the middle is where almost everyone quits. The first year, $300 a month is a sacrifice with nothing to show for it. The second year is worse. Now there's a little pile, enough to notice, not enough to matter, and a small pile is the most tempting money there is. It just sits there. It would fix the car. It would cover the trip you keep not taking. It whispers that you've proven the point, you can ease off, you can spend just this once. Just this once is the sound the whole thing makes right before it dies. Years, 3, 4, 5. The pile grew at the speed of paint drying. The math promised that somewhere out ahead, the curve would bend upward and start to run on its own. But a promise is not a feeling. Some nights you added it all up the resentful way, every $300 set aside, and looked at the total and thought, that's it? I gave up that much comfort for that? And in year 4, the honest answer was yes. That's all it was. That's the middle. Nobody films the middle, because the middle is a man doing nothing, correctly, for years, on faith he can't yet see working. The only reason you kept going was that stopping had its own cost, because stopping meant admitting Marcus was right, and some stubborn thing in you would rather be quietly wrong for another year than say it out loud. And then, somewhere around year 8, the things started to happen that everyone waits for and almost nobody actually reaches, because almost nobody makes it to year 8. The number in the account you didn't look at got big enough that it started making its own money, more than $300 a month, on its own, without a Thursday, without a stub, without you feeling anything in your coffee. The thing you'd been pushing, for the first time, started pushing back in your direction, and you almost missed it, because by then, not looking had become a habit, and habits don't announce their victories. I want to be honest about how it actually arrived, because you've been trained to expect a moment, and there was no moment. There was no envelope, no phone call, no total flashing on a screen with a sound effect. What there was an ordinary evening, years in, when you finally looked. You'd avoided it for so long it had become a kind of superstition. But one night you looked and you added it up, the account, and the thing it had grown into, and you sat with the number, and the number was 7 figures, and you felt almost nothing, a quiet, flat, strange calm, because a number that arrives one boring Thursday at a time doesn't feel like winning when it finally shows up. It feels like the natural weight of 11 years finally set down on the table where you could see it. Same box, it had just stopped weighing nothing. And nobody threw you anything. That's the ending nobody warns you about, the same one on the far side of every quiet version of this. Marcus didn't call to say he'd had it backwards. Why would he? From where Marcus stood, nothing had changed. You still drove the car. You still rented. You still were, as far as the visible world could tell, the guy who never quite made it. The wealth was real, and it was also completely private, And it turned out those two things were never in conflict. It had been private the whole time. That was the condition of it existing at all. So let me tell you what the small salary actually gave you, because it wasn't the money. The money was just the receipt. What the small salary gave you was the one thing Marcus's big salary quietly stole from him. It made you feel the gap. Every month for 11 years, it made you choose the smaller life on purpose and feel the exact size of what you were setting aside. And that feeling, uncomfortable, deliberate, unglamorous, is the whole of it. It's not a trick. It's not a hack. There's no version where you get it without feeling it. The bigger paycheck's great lie is that it will let you skip the feeling and arrive anyway, and it won't. And the people holding those paychecks are, a lot of them, further from wealth than you were at $41,000, because they never had to build the muscle, because nothing ever forced their hand. Now, here's where I hand it back to you, because this was never really about a warehouse or a box or a man named Marcus. You have a number. You know exactly what it is, and there's a decent chance you've been apologizing for it, quietly, for years. And some part of you has already decided that number is the ceiling on the life you're allowed to build. That the wealth is waiting on the other side of a bigger salary you haven't earned yet. Some promotion, some raise, some someday when the number finally gets big enough to make saving easy. But saving is never easy. It isn't easy at 41,000, and it isn't easy at 400,000, because the life expands to swallow whatever you feed it, unless you decide on purpose on some ordinary weeknight to feel the gap and keep it open. The size of your salary was never going to determine whether you got rich. The size of the distance you're willing to hold between what comes in and what you let yourself become, that was always the number that mattered. And that number has nothing to do with the one on your paycheck. So the next time you catch yourself rounding your salary up for a stranger, flinching at the smallness of it, apologizing to the air for a number that's honestly fine, I want you to ask yourself the only question that ever counted. Not how much is coming in. You already know that one. The question is how much of it you're brave enough to never spend. Because the paycheck was always going to be too small. They almost always are. The only thing that was ever really up to you was the gap, and whether you had the nerve to sit in it long enough for the arithmetic to do the rest.